Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's explainer. We're going to be diving into some remarkable, sometimes shocking, but honestly deeply fascinating events found in 2 Kings. We're talking ancient miracles, devastating sieges, unexpected heroes, and some intense political drama. It is a packed narrative, so let's jump right into the text.
Hello everyone, this is Tina Inside. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from 2 Kings chapters 6 through 8. So, our roadmap today covers 5 main steps. First up, Elisha's supernatural miracles. Second, a horrifying famine and siege. Third, the 4 lepers' choice. Fourth, Hazael and shifting power. And finally, corruption in the kingdoms. All right, let's jump right into section 1, Elisha's supernatural miracles. Now, you might be wondering how all these vastly different events tie together. I mean, we're going from highly personal individual miracles to sweeping national political collapse. But they all point to one unifying theme, and that is God's absolute, unwavering control over everything. You know, it's so easy to think of divine power only in terms of parting seas or bringing down vast empires, right? But here, we see how God's power extends even to the smallest, most everyday problems of a single individual. Take a look at this incredible parallel between the Old and New Testament. You have a poor prophet in training who loses a borrowed heavy iron axe head in the water. For him, this is a massive financial disaster, but Elisha simply throws a branch into the river and the heavy iron actually floats. He literally overrides the laws of nature just to show compassion for one impoverished student. And this beautifully prefigures the New Testament, where Jesus Christ demonstrates that exact same sovereign power over the laws of nature by walking on water. But God's power wasn't just for lost tools. When the king of Aram sends an entire army to capture Elisha, his servant wakes up and is completely terrified by the Aramean troops surrounding them. Elisha just prays for his servant's eyes to be opened, and suddenly he sees the mountains are absolutely full of horses and chariots of fire. This is the heavenly host. We're talking about a literal angelic army reflecting God's glory. It's such a brilliant contrast between the terrified servant's physical view of immediate danger and the invisible, overwhelming reality of God's supernatural protection. So the absolutely crucial point here is what happens next. You would totally expect Elisha to call down fire and destroy his enemies, right? But no. Instead, we see Elisha's surprising mercy. He strikes the army with blindness, leads them right into the enemy capital of Samaria, opens their eyes, and then he feeds them. He literally gives them a massive feast and sends them home peacefully. God uses Elisha not to slaughter the enemy, but to demonstrate divine authority and radical mercy, which temporarily halts all army and raids against Israel.
Moving on to section 2, famine and the siege.
Sadly, that temporary peace doesn't last forever. Years later, the focus shifts from these localized miracles to a devastating national crisis. King Ben-Hadad of Aram returns and totally besieges the capital city of Samaria. When we look at the cold, hard economic numbers from this time, they dramatically illustrate the severe inflation and absolute despair inside those besieged city walls. To put this into perspective, a donkey's head, an animal that was considered unclean and normally entirely worthless for food, is selling for the equivalent of an entire year's wages for a laborer. And dove dung, whether they were using it for fuel or meager sustenance, is being sold at exorbitant prices. The economic collapse is just absolute.
And honestly, this financial ruin is just the surface level of the tragic despair in Samaria. The famine reaches such an extreme level that starvation completely strips away all humanity from the besieged people. The text describes vividly, unimaginably horrific acts of survival taking place inside those walls. We're talking about families turning to cannibalism, consuming their own children just to survive. It is an incredibly bleak, horrifying picture of total societal collapse. Yet, right in the middle of this absolute darkest hour, Elisha steps forward with this bold promise. He says, "Tomorrow about this time, food will be sold at normal prices." It's a prophecy of sudden, almost impossible deliverance. I mean, to go from horrific hyperinflation to a completely restored economy in just 24 hours? It sounds absurd. In fact, a royal officer openly mocks God's power, basically saying that even if God opened the floodgates of heaven, there's no way this could happen. Which brings us to section 3, the 4 lepers' choice. To fulfill this impossible prophecy, God doesn't use the military elite. He doesn't use the wealthy. He uses the unlikeliest heroes of this entire narrative. 4 quarantined men living outside the city gates at the absolute bottom of the social ladder.
Let's walk through their stark, desperate logic here. Step 1. If they stay at the city gate or go inside, they starve to death because there's simply no food. Step 2. They decide to walk right into the enemy Aramean camp to surrender. Their reasoning is brilliantly simple and entirely desperate. If the Iranians kill us, we die, which was happening anyway. But if they spare us, we live. It's a literal do-or-die situation pushing them right toward the enemy lines.
And this is where we see God's sovereign timing brilliantly illustrated. As these lepers are walking, God creates a supernatural illusion in the Aramean camp. He magnifies the sound in the ears of the soldiers, making it sound like the roaring of massive allied chariot armies approaching. The irony here is just astounding. God uses the very thing the Arameans feared most, a massive military coalition, as a mere phantom sound to terrify them into completely abandoning their camp and fleeing for their lives.
So, when the lepers finally arrive, the camp is completely empty. They feast, they loot the abandoned tents, but pretty quickly their conscience kicks in. They realize they have to share this good news, and they actually fear divine punishment for their selfishness while their own city starves. So they return to report the miracle to a highly suspicious king. Eventually, the city's salvation is secured as the people rush out to eat. And tragically, remember that royal officer who doubted Elisha? He is trampled to death by the surging crowd at the gate, exactly as Elisha had prophesied. Okay, Section 4, Hazael and Shifting Power. We transition now from Israel to the geopolitical stage in Damascus, Aram's capital. This vividly shows God's absolute sovereignty even over foreign hostile thrones. Elisha travels to Damascus and meets with an Aramean military commander named Hazael. And it is a remarkably tense, highly emotional encounter. Elisha just stares at Hazael. He literally stares right through him until the commander becomes deeply ashamed and uncomfortable. And then the great prophet breaks down and begins to weep bitterly. So why is he crying? Because of his tragic foresight. God has revealed to Elisha the horrific acts Hazael will soon commit against Israel. The list of wartime atrocities is just brutal. Hazael is going to burn Israeli cities, kill young men with the sword, dash children to the ground, and destroy pregnant women. We see here that God sovereignly allows the shifting of global power as a form of discipline, even despite the immense impending pain it's going to cause. And the wheels of this regime change begin turning almost immediately. Hazael returns to his master, King Ben-Hadad, who is sick in bed. Hazael takes a thick cloth, soaks it in water, and stealthily suffocates the king, seizing the Aramean throne for himself. It is a completely ruthless assassination that perfectly fulfills Elisha's prophecy of a violent regime change. Finally, Section 5, Corruption in the Kingdoms. We've seen God's power over nature, over enemies, and over foreign nations. Now we turn inward, analyzing the internal, systemic decay within the leadership of both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Consider the rapid, confusing succession of kings during this period. In the 5th year of Joram in Israel, Jehoram begins an 8-year reign in Judah. Then, by the 12th year of Joram, Ahaziah takes Judah's throne at just 22 years old. This timeline really serves to clearly illustrate the sheer political chaos and the revolving door of leadership that completely defined this era. And notice how the corruption spreads just like an infection. In the northern kingdom of Israel, they are already deeply steeped in King Ahab's extreme wickedness. And then in the southern kingdom of Judah, well, Judah was supposed to be the faithful line of David, but it gets infected by the exact same evil. How? Through strategic political marriages. King Jehoram marries Ahab's daughter, literally importing idolatry and corruption directly into the royal courts of Judah. Yet despite this overwhelming failure, despite the endless greed and the human king's complete lack of integrity, look at what remains. God's steadfast faithfulness. God actively chooses to spare Judah from the total destruction they actually deserve. Why? Solely to honor his historical, completely unbroken covenant with David's royal line. It's a powerful reminder that human failure never, ever derails God's ultimate promises. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. When political leadership is driven entirely by greed, corruption, and an endless hunger for power, just like we saw with Ahab's line in Hazael, how does that chaos ultimately impact the suffering of everyday vulnerable people? It's a really heavy question, but it's one that this ancient text demands we ask, not just of history, but of our own world today. Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and keep seeking the truth.